Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Kirk. I'm with Dave Frank, and we are here to talk the news of the day, national news of the day. It was kind of slow for most of the week, except for a couple of stories, and then all of a sudden, all kinds of stuff happened today everywhere. But we're going to focus on three stories tonight, and the first one is the one that has been going on all week. As most of you know by now, Governor DeSantis and possibly Governor Abbott. I'm not quite sure how much Texas was complicit in this, but uh, had an operation in which they lured 48 immigrants, all or most of them from Venezuela. They are refugees here to basically apply for asylum. They were actually in the country legally. They came through a regular checkpoint, applied for asylum. They're in the country because the policy that Trump had of having them wait in Mexico, asylum seekers waiting in Mexico until their hearings, is no longer in effect with Joe Biden. So they were in the country legally. I'm not sure exactly what the circumstances are. We're learning more about it every day, but a woman mysteriously named Perla, who handed out a card with a phone number that nobody is answering right now, basically gave brochures and enticed these immigrants onto an airplane, promising them that they were going to be delivered to the land of milk and honey with jobs and housing and all of that. They went to Florida, where DeSantis spent apparently $12,000 a person or something like that, something ridiculous, on sending them up to Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard, of course, is a liberal place, famous for having rich people there. But I want to be very careful about that because, first of all, rich people go there and stay there, but the whole community is not rich. The median income is about $77,000, and most of the rich people are there for the summer and they're gone. So this was a community that was saddled with immigrants without any forewarning, and they rallied well. They got them a place of shelter. They raised money and did food, gave them clothing, and so they were there for a couple of nights, and then the immigrants were transported consensually to a Air Force base where they're now living as they have access to attorneys and health care and. I could go on about it, but DeSantis has been on the defensive all week about it. They're basically saying, well, this was to underscore the problems at the border. You only got 48, people, and now you're complaining. Of course, Martha's Vineyard is a small community, but never mind that. Now there is a lawsuit. Three of the immigrants have filed a civil rights action against DeSantis. So much to talk about. The question is there going to be a positive political fallout for DeSantis with this stunt? Is there going to be a negative fallout? Is it going to have any effect at all? Or is everybody on both sides just going to feel vindicated by the action? Dave, I'm going to bring you in here because I could just keep going on.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thanks for the setup. This is a really interesting case because it's not to cut to the chase, but I really do think that both major political perspectives in our country will feel that they benefit from talking about it and pointing to it for different reasons. I mean, I've listened to some commentators and spoken to some friends and colleagues on this, and it seems that people are pretty entrenched in their where they stood. Where they sat before this happened is where they stand on this issue now in their analysis. So I'll just do a pretty brief a couple additions to what you said. One is and I think you said it, and I think people know, but the Vineyard's actually an island.
Yes.
So when you look at the coverage of the people there, like a lot of the local folks who were saying, we just straight up don't have the housing even for the people that work here. And so because it's so expensive to live here. And one of the reasons that this was the chosen location as a stunt, and I guess I should say this explicitly, it's clearly being called a stunt even from both sides. the fact that the governor of Florida has chosen to charter a plane for a very small set of Venezuelans to fly to a high what's the word socioeconomic status community in New England. This was all calculated for political impact.
And let's not forget the legislature in Florida has given him $12 million to do these things, to do these stunts. But anyway.
Yeah. So from the perspective of where did these folks land? Like you said, they were people who had already declared their asylum. They came through a crossing point. They were legally in the country. But in order to prove that that people who are support sanctuary cities, who basically progressives and liberals, they wanted to prove that was an untenable or somehow illogical or a position that deserves condemnation. The idea was, hey, we'll just have a bunch of folks show up and watch how you freak out when they get there. So that, I think, was the intention. And in fact, there was a little bit of a freak out in the sense that people were saying, look, we can't possibly keep these people here. The National Guard was mobilized. They were transported off the island to a nearby military base in Cape Cod. So to a certain extent, just the physical movement of people did follow the staging of the stunt to a certain extent. Also, some of the people that were interviewed, I'd say, they were saying, like, look, we can't. This is what I started to say before. We can't handle 50 people coming, and that allows the fact that one person even said that to one interviewer was enough
Fox News made a big deal of it.
Sure, exactly. And then saying, well, we get 200,000 people a month at the border. That's approximately, I don't know, 7,000 a day. And if you're in these small border communities with limited resources, if you can't handle 50, how do you expect them to handle 7,000 or their portion of 7,000?
Well, for one thing, those towns have been receiving federal money to do that for a long time. I'm not saying it's enough or anything like that, but they know it. They've known that this is a problem. Martha's Vineyard, they didn't even bother to phone ahead. This is the egregious part. It's one thing to do a stunt like that, and we can argue about whether or not they were in fact kidnapped if they were fraudulently lured onto a plane, or not. Human trafficking, I think, is overstatement, but definitely fraudulent inducement. But using these people as pawns, and they were terrified. They were expecting to be greeted when they got off the plane, but nobody knew they were coming, so nobody greeted them at first. They had to find somebody to talk to, and then then everybody scrambled. And had they had that, they might have been more prepared for them right away, had food and clothing right away for them. But this is a small community, and that has not had to deal with this situation. So it's not really comparable. They didn't send him to California, right? I mean, if they had even sent him to Eureka, we could have handled it better. I mean, it was go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. But what I was going to say is I was just going to agree with you, actually, in the sense that there was depending on how this all plays out, it's because we're not 100% sure what happened, right? But depending on how this plays out, there was some degree of fraudulent inducement that happened. They did collect signatures saying, hey, do you agree to let us transport you so that you could get, a job and housing and access to resources, and we could send you to Boston? And they were basically, people were saying, yeah, job, housing, resources, Boston, sign me up. So that's
sure too.
So the criminality aspect, I think, is somewhat it's unknown currently, but in terms of, that's why I called it a stunt, because like you said, if your true intention was to help resolve the lack of consensus on immigration policy and help forge a collective resolution, a shared resolution, if you tell people you're going to send them to Boston, you send them to Boston. But it was a gotcha moment. It was let's pick where Obama lives. Let's pick Obama's vacation home, because the Obamas have a 30-acre house there. And
it's also a sanctuary jurisdiction.
A sanctuary jurisdiction. And just so people know, because I don't think everybody's aware of this, Martha's Vineyard is one of the first places historically in the United States that was an integrated resort community. So it was an actual sanctuary for African Americans going back long before other places were accepting community members, equals and peers, and so it's a historically significant location too, as that if you thought about a sort of nefarious vision, oh, you guys don't mind taking people in who everyone else considers outsiders, we'll
Right.
take these. So it was like a triple whammy. They knew that, DeSantis knew he was going to get big press, and he knew he was going to, people could point to, send him to Obama's neighborhood, and then finally it would also be like, send him to that rich zip code. But I want to just, if you don't mind, touch real briefly on,
Sure.
like you're saying, well, what will the political fallout be? So people who are, apparently people who are conservative are saying this was awesome. This was like an amazing gotcha moment. This is exactly like the type of combativeness and cleverness that we want from people to own the libs, so to speak. And so much so that Ann Coulter actually said, "Can we just make Ron DeSantis president now?" Like it's like that, that's only a cliche. I mean, it's only like it's one person. It's anecdotal rather, but it just shows you the level of appeal that this kind of stunt has for the intended audience.
But where it backfired is that we have all these videos of the community rallying to get food to them, to get all of that. So it was like they were ready. They said, some of them, because contrary to the homeless advocate who said they can't stay here, some of them were saying, just let us know next time. Right. Yeah. It was just, so it's like there. But before we run out of time, because we only have so much time on this, I want to get to the question of, okay, so it looks like conservatives feel vindicated. Liberals feel like they showed how liberals treat immigrants as opposed to conservatives. So that's both sides kind of there. But the question that remains is, what is the impact of this on not just the Venezuelan American community, but the Cuban American community in Florida? Venezuela is regarded by the right wing as a communist totalitarian dungeon like Cuba. These were refugees coming from this place. These are potentially people who, if they're anything like Cubans, might even register Republican if they ever become citizens. Maybe not. It's a little bit different with each one. It didn't happen necessarily with Vietnamese. Cuba is a bit different. But how is this resonating with Cubans in Florida? We're not exactly sure, but there have been some interesting comments, and that's not a demographic he wants to alienate in Florida.
I'd like to hear what the interesting comments are, because I haven't heard them directly. But I will mention that it's the case, like you said, that a significant portion of Latino immigrant community, especially folks coming from places like Venezuela and Cuba, are they're looking for freedom and opportunity, and so and they've got family values typically. Not to overgeneralize any group, but the saying goes that they are sort of ripe for being included in the conservative party. People that come from those places. So I'm curious to hear what South Florida Cuban people might have said.
And I don't have the names of the particular people handy, but these the Democrats in the Miami area are hitting on it. They are pressing this issue, and they seem to feel like they've got a break. One Cuban Republican said it was a mistake, and another one said, you don't treat people like that with disrespect. They've come all this way fleeing from a regime. They said they should have been treated with more respect. This isn't necessarily an indication that they're going to turn on DeSantis, but it does indicate that they probably weren't highly impressed with this. And one of the things that is kind of an indication that DeSantis recognizes this is on Friday he kind of changed his tune and said, well, they hit the jackpot. Look at all the great treatment they're getting. We should have sent it to them. Yes, those people are good people up there, right? I knew they were going to be taken care of really well, and that's a slightly different tone than he'd been. So obviously somebody had, in his advisors, among his advisors had said, you know what, this may not have been worked out exactly the way we hoped it would.
I gotcha. Yeah, I could totally see that. And in fact, there are, there is a lot of merit to the idea that it's a really dumb idea, because, like you said, it's dehumanizing, to, like you said, make people pawns, and also there's a class action lawsuit on behalf of these people, already going forward from an immigration rights community.
Investigation from the sheriff of San
Exactly.
Antonio.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you lure people under false pretenses, and that's fraud and worse. I don't know how much worse. I don't know what legally is worse, but there will probably be some fallout, on a small scale. But I just, big picture, like I said, thoughtful people who are reflective about immigration policy. I don't think that we, as a community of thoughtful people, benefit from treating people like pawns in a gotcha political, trench warfare type stunt like this.
And I just want to point out one thing. California receives more immigrants from the southern border than the rest of the border states combined. So so why didn't they send them to California? We've got lots of sanctuary cities here, because we have resources and are more prepared for it. The stunt would totally have no meaning whatsoever. They would be assimilated in like the other millions of immigrants that are here.
Yeah.
So it's a stunt, but very selective. Sent up to a corner of the country that just isn't. So I'll let you have the last word, and then we had to move on.
Yep, I heard one person who was on that plane say it best. He said, "Hey, look, I walked all the way. We walked all the way from Venezuela. People said they were going to give us services, and they did. We're very happy in America right now. This is amazing. Everyone's been very generous and kind, and we love it here." So that's the takeaway. America's generous, kind, and they love it here.
Okay, we're in the next topic here is a huge topic because so much has happened today alone. 3 big speeches, one by Biden at the UN, in which he basically slammed the mobilization that Putin has basically ordered. Putin has basically ordered that all of the occupied territories of Ukraine be annexed and hold special elections. Problematic because 2 of those 4, they don't have control of 2 of those 4 provinces. They are losing control in the east, and there is a heavy battle at Kherson, which looks like it might have been sort of a feint. They'd been promising this big offensive against Kherson, and then all of a sudden opened one out coming out from Kharkiv. And if people are paying attention to the news, the Russians lost a lot of ground, lost tons of tanks. Some of them they just abandoned, really expensive equipment, and they are on the run. And it actually hasn't stopped. I forget what the name of the river is, but the Ukrainians actually crossed that river, and they're pushing down towards the Donetsk. And if you haven't been paying attention to the war, you might not know what this means. But basically, the Eastern Front for Russia has virtually collapsed. So in response, there have been a lot of criticisms on Russian television. They're not criticizing Putin specifically. They're saying his advisors gave bad advice. We shouldn't have got into this war. Maybe we need to recognize the Ukrainians ethnically, but there's always on those shows some reactionary who says, no, we can't do that. We need to just press on. We haven't really fought hard, and blaming the military leaders, and even suggesting that they might need to use nuclear weapons, which Putin kind of made a reference to in his speech today, along with calling up 300,000 reserves who need training and are not even the best of the troops, and the best troops haven't been doing so well. But the 300,000 people are going to be basically drafted, and there were protests all over Russia today. There are lots of arrests as usual. And they've also passed a new law that says that if you desert or deliberately surrender to the Ukrainians, whatever deliberately surrender, I don't know how you non-deliberately surrender, but if you deliberately surrender, you've got a minimum of 10 years in jail. And possibly worse depending on the circumstances. So they're clearly on the defensive. Meanwhile, Biden gave a speech at the UN today that was apparently very well received, basically saying that this mobilization and the annexations are something that should chill everybody in the free world. I don't have the exact quotes, but we can get those. And Zelensky made a speech saying that there needs to be a special session in the UN. They're discovering more massacres, 500 graves in Izium, one of the cities that Ukraine retook. That's kind of gone back and forth throughout the war. I don't even know where to stop, so I'm going to let you into the discussion here. What am I missing? And let's talk about it.
Yeah, no doubt. Thank you for setting it up the way you did. A lot of detail there, as always. I think the big headline today. Well, first, looking backwards, the fact that Ukraine has in fact taken over now, several thousand square miles back in the Eastern Front is a big deal. Yes. In part, we talked about this, I think, recently, that Russia was sort of deliberately retreating troops in some cases to fortify their position. And so
they aren't leaving all their expensive equipment there. Radar systems.
No. That's right.
That wasn't strategic.
But core interest, like the ultimate core interest, is Crimea. Secondarily, that land stretch, the Kherson, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk corridor, land connecting by land from Russia all the way through Crimea. That stretch of land that Putin has declared is Russia. So now that sets the stage for what we heard in the last 24 hours, that this partial mobilization of 300,000 troops, and that's on top of they had already announced they're training 147,000 troops, if I remember correctly, that will be fully trained by January. So that bumps it up to nearly 500,000 people that they'll be able to roll out at 10,000 per division. That's 15 divisions plus 30 divisions. This is now what we're talking we're talking up to what does that work out to? 5 full armies. So that's we're talking field generals.
The initial invasion was less than 200,000. So this would be, in terms of people, much more of a mass. But they're also short on supplies, and they can't reproduce their T-72s, their standard tanks, their staple tanks. So it's going to be interesting. But as to whether or not this is even all that militarily significant, but we'll see.
It seems more of like trying to hold the line, like I said, in that corridor. But then on top of that, Putin made the announcement today because he knew Biden was going in front of the United Nations today and was going to call him, talk about mass graves, evidence of torture. This is the worst European crisis, we'll call it, since World War II. I mean, this Biden laid down the gauntlet in the UN. So what does Putin do? Caged and cornered here, he pulls out the nuclear threat, basically saying if Russian territory is breached, then the nuclear threat is real. And then so Biden, I guess, our intelligence services could have predicted that that's what Putin was going to say. So he said, they had it planned out, to explicitly say that this is, never, do not do this, never do this, lay down the line. So this is really, as hate to say, but this is as close as we've been probably in my lifetime to people, using nuclear weapons, even if it is on a limited basis. There's no winning in a situation like that. And again, not to use the term bluff, but it's bluster. It's braggadocio, which I think is, condemnable is not even the right word. It's the farthest extreme of condemnable. But then the question is, what to expect next. And so people have talked about this lasting for years. But then the fact, what's happening right now, what's happening today, if combat is going to happen for months or years, what about that referendum that Putin is trying to push for? The world will not recognize it, obviously, but it'll be just one more way that he could build up his national support, being his domestic support at home, saying, like, we've declared that this is part of us. They said they want to be part of us. Now you people, us Russians, we are all being attacked by NATO and the West, who they're called Nazis, etc. So this is, again, he's weak at home, and because of their country's economic isolation, because of their country's lack of economic development, lack of civil rights and freedoms. So who's left in his camp? It's these really ultra right folks who are saying, you're not being aggressive enough, you're not attacking the enemy enough. And so he's, like you said, it's advisors at this point. It's he's being there's groupthink happening, which is affirming his awful decisions, and it's escalating in a direction that's quite ugly and a little scary, to be honest.
Yeah, no, it is. This is the threat, and I think also wanting, because Zelensky has been asking for even longer range missile systems now to be able to do this, because the HIMARS, the long range guided rockets, have made a huge difference. That's part of what made this gains possible, is being able to take out all of the supply systems within Russia. And they've even attacked within Ukraine, and they've even attacked inside Russia a few times. Russia doesn't seem to want to make a big deal about that, because it shows how weak their air defenses are. But there was actually a film of a switchblade taking out some major intelligence person inside Russia. Of course, the West, it doesn't want to do something that will escalate this to a nuclear war. That's always the danger here, right? And how desperate will Putin become if this doesn't happen? Now, these troops that are supposed to get here in January, they can lose a lot more territory. I mean, the Kharkiv counteroffensive has not ended; they're still moving. The question is, and already. I don't know how many tanks have been destroyed, but close to 200 tanks were abandoned and are now part of the Ukrainian arsenal. So it's just along with a whole bunch of other equipment, as we talked about, and the Kherson front, which was apparently originally a distraction, is actually still happening. And partisans are fighting inside Kherson. According to Russian soldiers who are talking, and their phone calls are being intercepted, and the rest. And so, even in Kherson, how are you going to hold an election if there is partisan, quote unquote, terrorism happening? And there's even indications of partisan resistance in Crimea, which is supposed to be their most solid one. And so it's just, what do they do here? Well, and what does the West do? The West has to be very careful not to make Putin too desperate, I guess, but desperate enough to start thinking he needs to find a way to save face and pull out. That's probably what the most likely hope is, and claim victory, and then say, but we're giving the land back to Ukraine because we're nice people, right? And do this. And there's a few ways they can do that. I mean, and one of the things they could negotiate is access to the Sevastopol port in the Black Sea or something like that. They should have done that before. But, if they could make use of that without claiming it as their country, their territory, that's a possibility. But it becomes less and less the more we learn about these crimes and the rest. And if Ukraine feels it's winning, Putin's position becomes weaker and weaker, and the more he has to depend on apocalyptic threats.
Right. So access to the warm sea, the Mediterranean, or not Mediterranean, but by extension Mediterranean, the warm port in Crimea, that was the status quo ante at the time of Ukrainian independence. So Russia had a long lease on that property, on that real estate, the territory. Sorry, but that was not enough for this megalomaniacal strategy and plot that's unfolded. I do want to circle back to the domestic dissent, because I think that is a new development this week, or at least we're hearing more about it than I've heard in weeks or months. You've got city council elected officials in St. Petersburg and Moscow who are risking their life and their future to publicly criticize, and that's not a small happening. And the opposition party is mobilizing some of the people that are left in the country to go out in the streets. And so one of the common things that I heard one of these people say, I think it was a city council member in St. Petersburg, and said, if we are really liberators of our fellow Russians in Ukraine, then why are they fighting to the death to defend their Ukrainianness against us? And that can't be true. Like, let's have a public conversation about are they or are they not greeting us as liberators? That's a basic question, right? Would we still be at war after 6+ months if in fact they needed us? They don't need us. They don't want us. Something's wrong here. Let's talk about this publicly. That right there is considered treasonous in Russia alone. Yep, and if you can't say that one sentence, then that's it. Not everybody is going to.
And hopefully they have access to the preventive medicine that might deal with the vertigo of people who just happen to fall out windows in Russia on higher stories. They got to worry about that.
And one other piece of this too, I remember hearing a former foreign minister of Russia say, just target the Duma, just go after the members of the parliament, go, target them and their families and their families, go after them personally. If every single person in the national federal office knows that they are being persuaded to make peace, that being persuaded to have a future. At some point, granted, when it comes to raw power, Putin controls all the governorships, like Russia, sort of like the United States has states, and then we have territories, and then we have, like overseas possessions, and there's different legal statuses. Russia's got many, many variations of legal statuses when it comes to territories, but those people who run those territories are all like basically hand appointed by Putin. So it's it is a totalitarian iron grip over the actual levers of power. But that's when you've got 150 million, I think it's between 100 and 150 million people. That's not enough when you're talking about basic civil society, quality of life issues that are in the face of what we're witnessing here, which is attempted genocide in a sense. It hasn't escalated to a full-blown horror show, but it's not
as far as we know. But every time Ukraine retakes property, we find some horror shows, not huge mass, but 500 graves and the rest. But I'm really afraid what's going to happen if and when they originally take Mariupol and Kherson, what's going to be discovered there. But
it'll unfold and we'll see a little more. But I think right leading up to winter is going to be the most active, I think. So the coming weeks will be telling.
All right, we'll be talking more about that.
I am announcing that today we are filing a lawsuit against Donald Trump for violating the law as part of his efforts to generate profits for himself, his family, and his company. The complaint demonstrates that Donald Trump falsely inflated his net worth by billions of dollars to unjustly enrich himself and to cheat the system, thereby cheating all of us. He did this with the help of the other defendants, his children, Donald Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump, and Eric Trump, and former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg and Trump Organization Controller Jeffrey McConney. Claiming you have money that you do not have does not amount to the art of the deal. It's the art of the steal.
Okay, for our third segment, I wasn't planning to really discuss Trump all that much until today, but the news today just came out all over the place on several different fronts. One is Letitia James, of the New York State Attorney General's office, has filed suit. And if they get all of their penalties, it basically will put an end to the Trump charitable institution. I forget what it's called. And she also wants to get him banned from doing business in New York. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing. Almost all of the family is implicated in it. One of her lines at her press conference was, it's not about the art of the deal, it's about the art of the steal. This is it. Now Trump is downplaying it, saying she ought to be working on real crime, not this. And his attorneys are saying, we look forward to defending this case. I mean, that's kind of a meek statement, actually, when you think about it. Yeah, we look forward to defending it, not we are going to get this outrage dismissed. So we've got that happening. We've got January 6th committee has set a new date. They haven't said what they're going to discuss, but it's it's got to be within the next week or so. But it's because it's in September for another hearing. We've got the special master that Trump got appointed at the trial court level from one of his appointees who seems to be breaking from conservative, judicial precedent in terms of even allowing this to happen. The Department of Justice appealed that decision to even have the special master, saying that we need to continue to be able to investigate this without being hampered, because we need to learn if national security was at all compromised by this. And the appellate court just shut it down probably minutes before we started recording.
Yeah.
So, so I'm not quite up on that, but there's so much Trump. I'm probably forgetting something that happened with regard to Trump today, but I'm going to let you come in here, and you can focus on any or all of those. We're going to try to discuss the status of the Orange Man.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on a couple of the things that you mentioned. Sorry, I was looking to see if I saw a new headline since we even came on air. But so three things that I think are important. They're all important, but firstly, Letitia James. So the Attorney General of New York State. One of the analysts that I had heard briefly speaking about this said the case that she's presenting is going to be really easy for a jury to understand, because what we're talking about is Trump exaggerating values and of things to increase his lending power and expand his empire, and underestimating underestimating the value to pay lower taxes. And so one example, which I thought was really interesting, was Mar-a-Lago. He valued at like over $700 million because of all the uses you could use it for. But in fact, in order to get a use permit, he self-limited his uses, making it closer to less than 10% of that value, closer to 5% of the value. So there's a lot of black and white things like that, where they would take a specific asset, like his apartment where he lives in New York, and say, it is this size, so it's worth this much, and then triple the square footage to triple the value on a loan document. So nobody has no institution, no lenders, no underwriters, no legislators or oversight bodies had the intuition or desire to connect all these dots like this, but now it's been connected. So now she's able to lay out this case of basically a fraud scheme, and saying the penalty for fraud would be that you would be basically banned. Your Trump organization would be banned from certain business practices. Your family members would be banned from participation in this state. And it basically is, effectively making him a pariah for his business practices. And basically, the point is that the documents speak for themselves, and there's not a lot of persuasion that has to happen here. It's either they did do this inflation deflation scam or they didn't, and it appears that they did, based on what this evidence is forthcoming in trial, but based on what Letitia James's people have said today, sounds like that may be true. I mean, we don't know until it plays out in court. That's a big one. Do you want to say anything about that before we move on to a different one?
No, I think I think we've known this was coming. Letitia James has been actually pretty vehement that she has the goods, and it's finally happened. And it's going to take a while for this to unfold, but this is very significant. And again, I'll say, everybody says, "Oh, nothing sticks against Trump." McConnell isn't here to shut this down. It's one thing to do something to impeach when you need you need 60 members of the Senate to agree, and you get 57, including 7 Republicans, because the rest are basically going to protect them no matter what. So this is a different realm, and all of this is a different realm. And as we'll discuss a little bit later in the section, the 30-person appellate panel, 2 of them were Trump appointees. One was an Obama, but
wow,
we'll talk about that.
So
move on to that.
Yeah. So another element of what you talked about was the ability for the DOJ to move forward with those documents that are being reviewed by the special master. Before we get to the fact that there was an appellate court finding in favor of the DOJ moving forward, we can mention that Deary, this judge, they had their first hearing yesterday, and it was very, very matter of fact and very no nonsense, basically saying, look, you've hinted that you've declassified these things. We're here to determine the validity of that without any evidence or proof of the process that you underwent to declassify these things. We're just going to assume they're classified and move on. And
they never even said, because the lawyers don't want to get into the trouble that Giuliani did of misrepresenting things. Even if you're not under oath and a lawyer's not supposed to lie to a judge, they wouldn't even say whether anything had been declassified. They tried to get cute with it and say, well, it's up to the government to prove that they weren't declassified, and it's just like, and Deary is like saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too here.
Yeah. And again, sounds like inside baseball, but I think it is important to note that the case itself, that the reason that the warrant was issued to go in and get these documents out of the office, out of Mar-a-Lago, it had nothing to do with classification. And so people are calling out that the fight over the privilege versus non-privilege of these said, 700 pages of 100 documents that are a small subset of what was seized, that doesn't really matter. This is really just a delay tactic. And so Deary yesterday basically saying, I plan on moving this fast. We'll be done by November 30th for sure. I think it's no coincidence, or maybe it is just a coincidence, but it's telling that now the DOJ, the appellate judge, has decided, okay, like your case can continue. You can continue to review these documents. You've already gone through that. What's it called? That focus committee, the taint committee, the group within DOJ that reviews the documents to determine the things that should be viewed. So that's already happened internally. They've already satisfied their requirements for sequestering documents that may be too sensitive for the DOJ prosecutors to review. So they've already sectioned those off. So maybe that's why the appellate court said, no, you know what, you can move forward with your case. Because
they're saying that basically the DOJ has access to those documents, where the judge Eileen Cannon, the Trump judge, who has basically been leaning his way more than she should, according to most legal scholars, this panel said no. You can have your special master, you can do this other thing, but the DOJ, we're not going to deny them access to it. We find that their argument that they need to do this is compelling, and you haven't established that they don't need this information to be able to conduct their investigation, and also it's the current administration that has to waive the requirement for the documents. Trump is still acting like he's president, right?
Right.
Or his lawyers are trying to do it, and he's not president anymore, and he can't speak for the executive branch. But anyway, so it's a partial overruling. They're going to allow it to go, but they're not going to slow the DOJ down in their investigation.
Which is important for a lot of reasons. The timeline before the election, we'd like, I think people would like to see a little bit more progress, even though the case is going to play out however it plays out. The idea that it's moving forward, I think, is beneficial overall. But the third thing that you mentioned was the January 6th committee. This one literally is on a tight timeline through the end of the calendar year, through the next, through the winter break before the holiday break, before the next Congress takes over in 2023. So this committee will, in theory, not have exist once the Republican Congress House takes over, in theory anyway, like I said. But one thing that's really interesting is that, Kinzinger and some of the other people in the committee have been speaking publicly, like on the Sunday shows, et cetera. And they said, in addition to looking for more witnesses to come forward, they want to focus on Trump's fundraising efforts, where he talked about raising money from his supporters for for specific purposes that it turns out that money is not being used for. And so they are building the groundwork for a set of evidence that possibly Merrick Garland and the DOJ could use for fraudulently bilking his supporters out of all those donations. And the press that comes from the January 6th committee airing the details of this, in theory, will also just be some of that avalanche of bad news on the Trump team.
Yeah, there's other news too here. I mean, Eric Hirschman, his lawyer, actually it's come out that he actually tried to warn Trump about the legal perils of having these documents last year. I've been trying to read to see how it came out, because that sounds like attorney-client privilege. But at any rate, it reached the New York Times. And so it's not like he was totally shocked about this. His own attorney, at least one of them, was telling him, you got to get those documents back. This came out in the past couple of days. This was a week of Trump stuff, and this is a time, of course, that the Republicans would rather Trump not be in the news, right? I mean, this is exactly, Trump is probably about 80% of the reason that the Democrats are likely to hold the Senate and could possibly hold the House, and yet here he is all over the news.
Yeah, and I think one of the pieces of information that came out that I hadn't seen, but recently crossed our radar, was Ginny Thomas has agreed to be one of those witnesses. So that's just another card falling.
Justice Clarence Thomas's wife, who's caught up in a lot of this stuff, and in a case involving her, for which Justice Thomas did not recuse himself from in a decision. A lot going on here. And she's kind of a loose cannon in some ways. I mean, just watching a few of her interviews, so that could be very interesting. We'll see. I don't know if it's going to be like behind closed doors deposition, or if she's going to be at the hearing that they've announced. I don't know. So, again, this news is like breaking as we're recording, so it's really hard to keep up.
Just one more piece of context, and as hopefully viewers, listeners, colleagues, and peers know, I'm not in the business of defaming or saying bad things about anybody. I want to build towards a better future, and I think as much information as we have can help that happen. But some of these messages that were streaming in, the January 6th committee evidence that shows that some of these messages streaming in to Trump's closest advisors, his chief of staff, all throughout January 6th, these people apparently are true believers that the country was at risk for awful things without Trump as president. Certainly sounds like what they believe. Ginny Thomas was in that mix of folks really lobbying hard via text to try to get Trump's ear throughout this 48 hours or so, or for that matter, any period of time leading up to this. So it'll be really interesting to figure out her exit strategy from any kind of moral condemnation in what she'll say publicly about who said what and when with respect to Trump's innermost circle that was really pushing what appears to have been a what's the word? A conspiracy to obstruct a legal proceeding. That seems to be where this could fall out to land on Trump's culpability.
Other news that came out in the past week is the Republicans are a little bit annoyed with, probably a lot annoyed with the fact that Trump is not all that money that he took in, for campaign that was sort of promised to be used for the candidates. He's not really being generous with that money. He's not writing a lot of checks, and they're kind of pressuring him to start doing that. But he's not somebody who likes to part with money. We know that. And, and he'd much rather find a way that he can personally benefit from the campaign funds that he raised. It's just like the nonprofit up in New York. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And so I guess maybe we should, in the last couple of minutes here, talk about, what is going to be the political impact of all this? I mean, we know that there is a set segment of the Republicans that just absolutely will not see anything bad about this. But there are also a lot of Republicans who are really worried about how this is costing them the center, the independent votes. And is he going to be campaigning for people? Do people even really want him to campaign for him? He supposedly shows up to a campaign event and he starts talking about his own stuff, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. I know we just have about a minute left. We'll use the example of this past weekend. Trump was in Ohio, and during his speech, which was purportedly in support of J.D. Vance's senatorial run, he was talking an awful lot about QAnon, trying to drum up that smallest of the small sliver of the national Republican base. Depending on how many people you say, it's about a third of the party supports him, maybe, and the party represents a third of the country, so you're talking about a sliver of the country that is really dug in, entrenched, supporting him. And then so he goes out and he has that platform and he stokes up their, we'll call it, primal energy. But what does he do? I heard a Republican commentator say this. When Trump got the most feedback and support is when he was saying, these liberals, these Washington insiders, they took this from you. They took your good country from you. And that he has subsequently pivoted to, these people, it's terrible what they've done to me. They've taken it from me. And that he's sort of crossed the line where he's now a cult of personality. And I think people are starting to see it. Not that he's ever not been, but I think people are more aware at this point.
All right, we are at the show where we cover predictions. We're going to try to cover a little bit of the news. There was a lot more news. We couldn't discuss it all this hour. So what have you got for us, Dave?
So, Eric, this goes so fast every week, man. They have a lot of fun with you here. So one of the topics we were going to talk about, which we're going to have to pick up next week, is Manchin, Senator Manchin, West Virginia, and how somehow he's now being vilified by and in the what's it called, the dirty little deal that he put in place in the inflation fighting bill that got passed by the Democrats on a party line vote. That dirty little deal, which was supposed to take away limit the oversight of environmental proposals, environmental permitting. That was the big oil industry, big energy industry, huge thing that he fought so hard for all these months and years. Well, it turns out that could potentially be the undoing of that provision of the bill, because while Schumer has agreed that he's going to put it in the budget reconciliation bill to continue the government operating beyond January 30th, they're not going to let the government shut down. So if the Republicans refuse to support the energy industry and the progressives refuse to support Schumer and Biden in getting this bill passed, they will have to pull that dirty little deal out to get to prevent the government from shutting down, and that's what I predict is going to happen.
Okay, well, nobody seems to like Manchin these days. Go figure. All right. Well, I'm going to be very quick here. Going to my predictions. Maggie Hassan, I don't know if I'm saying her name, Hassan, the current senator in New Hampshire. She was considered one of the most vulnerable of the Democratic senators at the beginning of this race. They were hoping that Governor Sununu would run against her. It was pretty much the consensus that if he did, he could have the Senate seat, but he doesn't like where the National Republican Party is going and didn't want any part of it, so he didn't enter. So now with last week's primaries, Republican U.S. Senate candidate Don Bolduc is the one. He's the Trumper. He's kind of nutty. We've talked about that, and I'm calling it now for Maggie Hassan. The first poll that came out with him specifically has her 11 points ahead, not even close. And I think the Republicans blew an opportunity there, just like they're probably blown it in a bunch of other states. So I'm calling it for Maggie Hassan, who will win her Senate re-election in November. All right. Well, that takes us to next week. We'll have plenty to talk about next week because we already have it. The story's developing. So until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.